The Chazal say, Hakel b'mazle talya afili sefer Torah shebehecha. Everything's talya mazel. I come here and I give classes, yeah? And when you have a Yom HaPagrech, I say a word. But I got a complaint from somebody. So the complaint was made by me that, okay, if Friday had not been on Friday, in other words, there wasn't a Maimer day, I would have done it then. We'll talk a little bit about the Yeshiva's Tomchei Tmimim. Yeshiva's Tomchei Tmimim. And I'm going to give you a long Hagdama, a long background. Not too long, but a long background. There's a story which I have told you before. I put it in my shiurim. I think the story is mamish, a piece of Jewish history. Not Lubavitch history, Jewish history. That the Tzemach Tzedek passed away in 1866. Before Pesach, 1866. In the weeks and months before his histalkus, when the Tzemach Tzedek passed away, he would call in his youngest son, B'nai Mamalim Akeme, his successor, the Rebbe Marash, and he would open up a Medrash Rabbah Shmois and he would read inside. He would read it inside. That it says in the Pasuk, Vayamos Yosef v'chol echav v'chel aderehu. Yosef died and his brothers died and the whole generation died. And then it continues of Bnei Yisrael, Paru, Vayishitzu, Vayirbu, Vayatzmu, the Yidden flourished. So the Rebbe, so the Medrash brings this pasuk. V'yamas Yosef died. V'chol echav, and all of his brothers died. V'chel aderehu, and the whole, and anybody who saw oil was gone. So it says in the Medrash, Afal Pisha Mesu Elu, Alekayim Shalelu Lemes. Even though all of these people died, their God didn't die. This was what the Tzemach Tzedek would read to the Rebbe Marash, and the Rebbe Marash would stand and smile. Then he would walk into another room and cry b'dmoi shlish. Because the Rebbe Marash was being told by his father, if I may use these oisias, the good days are over. The golden age of Chassidus ends then. When the Tzemach Tzedek passed away a year before, after all the Gdeli Arabeim from the Chassidus, from all the Polish, were nostalgic. And then started the Tzaris. 50 years later, you had World War I, so you had the Richtige Tzaris. But the beginning of the end was then. And the Tzemach Tzedek was telling his son, what I'm leaving for you, verstehst the Schus. So the Tzemach Tzedek would read the Medrash, Afal Pisha Mesu Elo. In other words, the beginning of the Tzaris, of the Ikvis, the Mashiach, you can trace to that. And I'll tell you a second story in a similar vein, but this we can debate. The first story you can't argue. In the early 1880s, there were a lot of pogroms in Russia. So they had what was called Aliyah Rishonah. A lot of Jews went to Israel. It was before Herzl and before Zionism. The name of the movement was Bilu, Beis Yud Lamed Vav, and it was an abbreviation for the words Beis Yaakov L'chu V'nelch, House of Jacob, come, let's go. Had the Rebbe Marash gesagt, the Rebbe Marash said, if they would add the two words Ba'oir Hashem, he would join them. If they made the movement not Bilu, but Bilu-i, right? Bilu-bi, Beis Yaakov L'chu V'nelcha Ba'oir Hashem, he would join. If the Rebbe Marash leaves Russia, Pona Heda, Pona Ziva, Pona Hadara, the Eibishter leaves Russia. The Yiddishkeit leaves Russia. He made the decision to stay. His son stayed. His grandson stayed. Until they physically threw him out of the country. Why? You don't go into Golus unless you go with chains. The only person that went into Golus, B'chovid, was Yankov Avinu. After that, you go in chains. Had the Rebbe Marash made the decision to go to Eretz Yisrael, I say, if you take these two stories and put them together, the history of the Jewish people would be materially different. Very different. Would it be nicer? I have to assume that it wouldn't. Because if it would have been nicer, the Rebbe Marash would have made this choice. But they stayed in Russia. The problem was, the corrosion of the Jewish world was from the inside out. It wasn't from the outside in. It wasn't like today. The first symptoms that a person is going off the derech are on the outside. How he dresses, what's with his beard, what's with his sneers. Then it was from the inside out. You had people with beards and payas who sat Yema Valayla and learned Torah, and Rahman al-Islam, they could smoke a cigarette on Shabbos. I knew a Jew. I didn't know him well. I met him. I gave him labels Islam. He died a few years ago. He wrote a wonderful, wonderful book called I Believe, Ani Maimin. It's a very, very good read. Young people have to read that Sefer. Senior citizens can enjoy it. Young people have to read this book. So he told me a story. He lived in Kovna. Had a very, very large Jewish community, Kovna. What people don't know, there's a famous Litvish yeshiva called Slabodke. Slabodke was across the bridge. It was the other side of the bridge of Kovna was Slabodke. So he says, when he was a child, he was a terrorist. When he was 80 years old, he was also a terrorist. When he was a child, he was a terrorist without any constraints. His father used to tell him, Shahi would get up early, in the Ken Schlafen, and his father told him, Leipke called him, don't go down this street. You're talking 7:30 in the morning on Shabbos, 8 o'clock in the morning. No, if your father tells you not to go, what do? The first thing you do is you run to that street. He told it to me himself. This is not Mipiya Shmua. I heard it directly from him. So when his father told him not to go down that street, so the next Shabbos, he took a walk down that street. And he hears a Yid learn Gemara from Kol. A Yid was learning Gemara out loud with such a sweetness. And he couldn't understand why his father would not want him to see it. Until he came to a Yid sitting on the porch on a Shabbos morning learning a Gemara with a cigarette. With a cigarette. You're not going to see that today. You just won't. If you have a cigarette, you don't have a Gemara. The corrosion was from the inside out. So the body was rotting. You understand? And it rots and it rots and it rots and it rots and then it falls apart. There was a lot of tzoros. Yidden had no shortage of tzoros, b'chlal. And in Russia especially. But there were tzoros pnimiyos. It was the tzora of the chacham, the intellectual, the smart guy tzoros, the apokoides, the philosopher, the efshenish. That's all it takes. You talk about Amunah Tehera and you make a funny face, you just kill the whole Amunah. And this was a disease in Russia. Jews b'chlal are people of the book, and they're quite intelligent. And of course, amongst Jews, there are the most intelligent ones. They were the ones learning in the yeshivas. The yeshivas was a collection of the greatest minds of Russia, and there were seeds, they called it worms, they used to call it, seeds of heresy inside the yeshivas. So boys were learning Kol HaTeira Kula. When it came to Emunah in the Meibish, and Emunah in Teira Min HaShamayim, a lot of them were very severely affected in an adverse way. Reb Mendel Marazav Al-Shalom used to fabring with us. I was pushed laying in bed last night, replaying a fabringen with him from Malateira. He gave us something that I can't give my students. Reb Mendel Marazav. I pushed replay the fabringen in my own mind of him singing the Nigunim of the Alter Rebbe, Magei Tach Tzachai Yellow. His father heard the Nigunim of the Alter Rebbe from the Rebbe Rashab, and he, every once in a while, he would push it, sing all the Nigunim the way he heard them from his father. And I was reliving this. So that Mendel talked about his own father's coming to Lubavitch. So he said he learned in one of the famous Litvish yeshivas. Can I ask you a favor? Young lady, can you sit over there? Do you mind? Maybe it was Slabodke. And he had a more in the cup. Chani was a gone. Chani had an incredible mind. And there was a Lubavitcher Chassid who was always snooping around for a kele, for Chassidus. Somebody that you could bring to Chabad. And he offered to pay Chanya's way to come to Lubavitch for Rosh Hashanah. Reish Nun Ches, as I did erzählt. He came, and during Rosh Hashanah, the Rebbe Rashab said one or two Maimorim, but it was a hemshech. He didn't finish. So after Rosh Hashanah, this guy says to Chanya, come, I'll take you back to yeshiva. He says, no, I want to hear the end. I want to hear the rest. He had a very, very philosophical mind. He had never heard Chassidus Chabad. And even though there's a lot of strange language, he was able to keep up. And he wanted to hear. So the guy, he was so thrilled. Chayes, would you mind give me the money And when the Hemshech is finished, I'll buy my own ticket, I'll go home. He never left Lubavitch. That's his story. That's what Lubavitch. So the Mendelssohn's detailed that when Chanya was in yeshiva, all the Bachrim were reading the philosophies. I mean, you're talking now, the 1890s. Everybody read philosophy. And a lot of these philosophies were very cold and in many cases, pashat, heretical. Al Hashem v'al Mashiach. He says, my tate, Chanya, he says, had a Yireh Shamayim Tivis from his cradle. See, the story of Chanya Morozov is really ironic. He was born in Cherkas, which was a Chassidish city. His father was a diehard misnagid, and his father passed away. His mother was afraid that because his father had passed away, that the Nebuch Harayim found sufficient Chassidim, hat them verschickt in Rusland where there were no misnagdim. And little did she know, she went from the kettle into the fire. He was so close to the Rebbeim, Chanya. So here, how Mendel worded it, all the Bachrim read the philosophies. The Tate, my father wouldn't read. Oh, but Spinoza had gelehnt. Spinoza's philosophy is based on Kabbalah. I'm just giving you an idea that if Chanya Morozov, because of Yireh Shamayim, only read Spinoza, you understand what the other Bachrim were reading? And you're talking about the best minds in Russia. The best minds in Russia. They were learning Gemara on a Shas level, on a Bavli Yerushalmi level, on a Kol Terekula level. They were reading these Svarim, the Bicher. I've told you this before, that it says in the Friedrich Rebbe's Rishimis that the Rebbe Rashab, by his Seder, when he would come to Chocham Mahu Eimer, now we always think of the Chocham in the positive light, that he's a Ben Chocham and he has Yireh Shamayim. So the Rebbe Rashab is given Sakonis. Every year, when the Rebbe Rashab got to the Ben Chocham, he would start talking about the Klip of Seichel. And the Friedrich Rebbe said it was hard to listen to. The Rebbe Rashab would go off the handle about these people who are so smart, and Rachmana Litzlan, their intelligence is killing their neshama. This was the reality in Russia. When Tomchei Tmimim was founded in 1897, Russia was full of the best yeshivas, the most, the biggest, and by far the best yeshivas in the world. Russia's Lite. You read how the Friedrich Rebbe talks about how the Litvische, we call them today Misnagdim, but they respected Torah. They would give their shirts for a Ben Torah. The biggest and the biggest and the best yeshivas in the world, and the most yeshivas in the world, were in Russia. And understand, Chassidish Rebbes didn't make yeshivas. They didn't. Chassidish Rebbes taught you how to serve Hashem. The standard operation in Russia, and even in Poland, but in Russia for sure, was if you would be accepted to a yeshiva, and to be accepted to a yeshiva was 1 out of 1,000. They learned till Bar Mitzvah in Cheder. At Bar Mitzvah, most of the kids went to work or got married. Those with exceptional heads would sit in the local shtot, and the Rav, and a Rav 150 years ago was not like a Rav today, would be Rosh Yeshiva. They were big Talmidei Chachamim. And if the Rav saw amongst his Chevre somebody who we thought was exceptional, he would write him a letter of recommendation and send him to the yeshiva he had learned it. And this boy was the best boy in his whole shtetl, who would show up at this big yeshiva, and there were 200 candidates and 20 availabilities. In other words, there was a lot of competition. The yeshivas had the best minds. And in these yeshivas you had kfirah. But you didn't see it. You saw beards and payas. The Misnagdim started to shave. But the Chatchila, the Misnagdim, Chassidim looked the same. They had full beards. And in Russia, the Lubavitchers didn't have longer payas. They looked exactly the same. At some point, the Misnagdim started to shave, which is the Chafetz Chaim was so unhappy about it. But inside, they were rotten. So the way it says in the Rebbe, our Rebbe's Rishimis, our Rebbe's journal, the Friedrich Rebbe told me, I mentioned it on Friday, the yeshiva is von the Sachen, was ich auf ausgepoilt auf Chasene. That's a quote. The Friedrich Rebbe told our Rebbe, the yeshiva is one of the things I was able to get from my father for my wedding. It was like a wedding present. What was the story? And again, all of this I'm quoting from the Rishimis, I'm not making it up. That when the Friedrich Rebbe came to his father, the Friedrich Rebbe was 17 when he got married. No? So when he came to the proposal, he was 15. But the Frierdiker Rebbe wasn't 15. The Frierdiker Rebbe was 500. The Frierdiker Rebbe was another neshama altogether. When the Frierdiker Rebbe came to his father with the idea of the yeshiva, his father's first reaction was, "Was misnagde sheshtik a yeshiva? Misnagde bei yeshivas." That's how it was. But there was no such thing as the misnagde yeshiva. You have to understand. They were yeshivas. They taught you Torah, period. The yeshivas were full of Chiddush HaBachrim. And it wasn't like today, you send the boy to Misnagdish Yeshiva, he changes his nusach. He cuts his beard, he starts davening Ashkenaz. In those days, all of the best boys in Russia, whether they were Chassidim or Misnagdim, learned in these famous yeshivas. Volozhin, Baranovich, Navardok, Mir, what did I mention before? Slabotke. The yeshivas didn't try to influence you. Yom Tov, half the Bachrim went to their Rebbe. And a lot of the Misnagdim would go there, they didn't mind. Yeshivas taught Torah, but on the highest level imaginable, mamish. So when the Frierdiker Rebbe wants to make a Chassidish yeshiva, his father says to him, "It's not our business. All the boys who are learning in the yeshivas, they want Chassidus, come to us. We don't make yeshivas. The Misnagdim have yeshivas." And the Frierdiker Rebbe said, "No, we need a Chassidish yeshiva." When you look at it now, you see vision. And mit alles nicht sagen, aber wenn wir sagen von deswegen, the Frierdiker Rebbe knew what he's going to have to deal with. If the history of the world would end with the Rebbe Rashab, you wouldn't need Tomchei Tmimim. But because the history of the world would not end with the Rebbe Rashab, you needed Tomchei Tmimim. The Frierdiker Rebbe said to his father, I'm sure he didn't say it this way, I need a yeshiv. And his father didn't want. And they discussed it once, and they discussed it twice. His father reluctantly agreed. And when his father reluctantly agreed, he told him, "Du sollst wissen, was du nimmst auf sich." Which means in English, you're taking a big responsibility. Understand what you're taking. Du sollst wissen, was du nimmst. It's not poshut, making a Chassidish yeshiva. This is what happened behind the scenes that we know from the Rebbe's journal. Now, the Rebbe heard this from the Frierdiker Rebbe in the 30s. Almost 100 years ago, yeah. But we found this out after Gimel Tammuz. We didn't know this. I mean, the Rebbe said more than once that the idea of Tomchei Tmimim was from the Rebbe Rayatz. But then when you read the story of Tomchei Tmimim that's official, you don't see this at all. What's the official version of the story of Tomchei Tmimim? And again, I don't think it's a contradiction. It's just two madreges. The Rebbe got married on a Friday. The Frierdiker got married Friday, Yud Gimel El Tov Reish Nun Zayin, 1897. And I told you this before. I have a neighbor, sein Gesund, that heißt Harav Baruch Brickman. Reb Baruch Brickman. He lives on the corner by me, Sterling Street. So he had a schus, I don't know why, that he worked, quote, upstairs. He was close to the Rebbe's Nechamadina. She trusted him. You had to earn your way in. He was trusted by the Rebbe's Nechamadina, and he was in the house. And he told me once, I was able to go into the Frierdiker Rebbe's room. There's a closet, and in that closet they had the Mashiach Sefer Torah. In that closet they had the, quote, Chimadan, the famous valise that hold the ksavim of the Rebbe Rashab, and on and on. He saw it all. So he told me once that the Rebbe's Nechamadina got Mishigassen. And I don't mean it in a negative way. If she wanted to tell you something, but she wanted you to listen to her, she would pull you into her husband's office, and she told it to you in front of his table. And in her mind, you couldn't refuse her when she did that. If she really meant business, she took you into the Rebbe's cheder, and then she instructed you, and in her mind, this means the Rebbe is telling you, I don't know how effective it was, but this was her thing. Another thing he told me was that from time to time, she would have these interactions, these moments. She would go into the Frierdiker Rebbe's room, clean it up spotless, and make it exactly as it was before Yud Shvat. They used that room. They used to go into that room. They davened in the room. She would make up the room exactly as it was before Yud Shvat. She had these moments. And one of the things that she did, he told me he saw this. The Frierdiker Rebbe was Klayachal limited. He had Ava B'Tanugim, the quote the Shia from before. So next to his desk, they had a swivel shafer. It was a bookcase, the height of a desk. It wasn't very tall. That Sfarim on all sides. There was a circle. You could spin it. So there was room for a lot of Sfarim that the Rebbe could access without having to stand. You understand? This swivel shafa was empty. There was nothing in it. The Sfarim were put away. I don't know. One day, the Rebbe went into her husband's cheder, and she made up the room, as she would do occasionally. And when he walked in afterwards, there was one sefer in this swivel shafa. So he was curious to know what sefer she put there. So he looked. It was a leather-bound Sefer HaZechreines Chelik Rishon. The Frierdiker Rebbe's memoirs, Volume 1, came out during the lifetime of the Frierdiker Rebbe. Volume 2 came out in Tafshin Tezvav, 1955. But Volume 1 came out during the Rebbe Kvayachol, Chaim Chayose Ba'almadeh. It was a leather-bound Sefer HaZechreines Krach Rishon. And inside was an endorsement from the Rebbe to her. Our Rebbe had given her a gift for Yud Gimel Elul Tov Shin Zayin. Yovel HaChamishim, the 50th anniversary of the Chassaneh. It said Yud Gimel Elul Tov Reish Nun Zayin. Yud Gimel Elul Tov Shin Zayin. I think it said Yovel HaChamishim, 50th wedding birthday. Mit beste Wunschen Mendel. With best wishes, and the Rebbe signed his second name. So when she made up her husband's room, way after the Histalkus, what did she put that her husband should see if he were to walk in? I have a connection to Mendel. That's the story. Anyway, I'm sorry I took a lot of time to tell the story, but I think it's a delicious savant story, piece of Lubavitch history. Anyway, the Rebbe got married on a Friday. Why got married on a Friday? It's Taka Amaisa for Chayelu, because the Alter Rebbe's father got married on a Friday. And from them it's geworden a minig that the Beis Harav, if they could, made chasnes on Chai Elul. Sunday was Tesvav Elul, Chamish Asa B'Elul. And the Rebbe Rashab announced that he's calling a meeting of Anash. And I would imagine it was by invitation. I don't think it was whoever wanted. And there were two sugim, two types of people. Everybody came to the chassid. If you were Lubavitcher chassid, the Rebbe Rayat was a ben yochid. The Frierdiker was an only child, a Rebbe. If you were Lubavitcher, you were by that chassaneh. If you could walk, Kol sheyochel alas baragav, you were by the chassaneh. The chassaneh was a shturim de sheva brachas. The Frierdiker Rebbe Rashab said, Chassidus was a whole week sheva brachas. The Rebbe once said, "What's Chai Elul?" It's one of the sheva brachas of the Frierdiker Rebbe. Because that's how it was felt. Anyway, by this meeting you had the Gedolei Chassidim, that means the Rabbonim. I told you this before. In a Lubavitcher community, there were the big five. Like Lahadl, you have. In other cases, the big five. Who were the big five? The Rov, the Mashpia, the Shoichet, the Melamed. And who was the biggest of the five? The Gvir. Those were the big five. The Rov, the Shoichet, the Mashpia, the Melamed. The Melamed was the biggest chassid, but he was the poorest and the most broken, most bittel dikerit, and the Gvir. The Gvir ain't clean again. So the Rebbe invited the Gedolei Chassidim, the Rabbonim, the Mashpiyim, and the Balabatim, the rich Chassidim. And he told them the following. He says, I am planning to ask you a question, because I want to hear your take, your opinion about this question. But I need you to know before I ask you that I've already made up my mind. I've already made up my mind. I just want to hear how you're thinking about the question. And he proposed to them the idea of making a yeshiva. And he explained to them, there's no shortage of yeshivas in Russia. The biggest institutions of learning in the world were in Russia. The biggest and the best. Mamish, the best. Creme de la creme. There's nothing to talk about. But I want to make a Chassidish yeshiva. And he probably said that at that time, we're taking only Bochrim was Ken Lenin Farzich. We're taking Bachim who don't need a Rosh Yeshiva, they can learn by themselves. And the purpose of the yeshiva is to provide them with mashpiyim, who are going to teach them Chassidus, and v'oid v'hu ha'ikir avoid al derech ha-Chassidus, serving Hashem according to Chassidus. In other words, yeshiva was made not for Lomdis. There was no shortage of Lomdis in Russia. He was going to take Bacharim who in Lomdis, as they say in Yiddish, were selbstständig, they already were standing on their own 2 feet. They were making yeshiva to be madrech and mechanech Bacharim and darkei Chassidus Chabad. This is the idea. Of course, the yeshiva would grow and grow, as I'll explain momentarily, but that was the original seed. And he said, there's no shortage of yeshivas, but we need to have Teira Tmima, Teira with Yiras Shamayim. And unfortunately, the Rebbe Rashab understood that the situation in Russia was dire. You had all these big Talmidei Chachamim, and a considerable number, I'm not going to say a many, but I'm not going to say a roi, but a considerable number, Rahmana Litzlan, if you took off the outer shell, were rotten. And as soon as the revolution happened, they all showed their rottenness. They became Rahmana Litzlan, the Yefsekim, the Yefseksia Harura, as the Frierdiker Rebbe calls it. So the Rebbe Rashab makes his proposal, and he asks them their opinion. So understandably, it came down on predictable sides. The Balabatim, the Chassidim with money, who would have to pay the bill, said, no, bad idea. He said, we could barely support the Rebbe and his family. How can we support a yeshiva? The Kli Kodesh, the Rabbonim, the Mashpiyim all thought that it was a great idea. And after they offered their opinions, the Rebbe said that I made the decision to make the yeshiva. Now, he didn't say the Frierdiker Rebbe told me. There was no such thing. And he said, 10 years I'm struggling with this question. Now, I don't know how you say these words. 10 years. I mean, the Frierdiker Rebbe gave him the idea when he was 7. It's possible. I'm telling you it's possible. But 10 years, the Frierdiker Rebbe was 7. 10 years I don't, again, I bet myself I don't have any questions. I just don't understand everything. It's 10 years I'm agonizing over this. And I've made a resolution that we're going to make the yeshiva. I've heard from, I guess, pretty good sources that the Rebbe Chayamushka used to say that the Rebbe, mein Mann, as she called him, when he had an idea, would struggle with it for a long time, sometimes for years. And when he was struggling with it, he wanted to hear every reason he shouldn't do it. And he would debate it with people, whoever his people were. I'm assuming it was her. Once a decision was made, it was like moving Everest. It was rak. In other words, until the decision was made, he was so open to having the idea challenged. But once he made a achlata, there was no going back. And the Rebbe said, we're making a yeshiva. And he explained that, like I said, in the beginning, they didn't have any Rosh Yeshivas. Mashgichim, that means people who took attendance, that you came to Seder. And the Mashgichim, and we can't learn it, the Mashgichim are big Talmidei Chachamim, they could talk to the Bochrim and learning. But the Ikki was the Mashpiyim. The Mashpiyim. This was Sunday, Tesvav El, and they immediately looked around where they're going to get the first Bochrim. And by the way, he, very shortly thereafter, I don't know how much after, but very shortly thereafter, appointed his 17-year-old son, the newly married Rebbe Ayat, as the Menal Pale. When the yeshiva started, all the Bochrim were older than him. In biologische Jahren, they were older. Rebbe Ayat was 17, they were 20, 21, 22. Yeah, they were older than him. And the Frierdiker Rebbe was appointed the Menal Pale. That means the yeshiva is run practically, it's the Rebbe's yeshiva. And the Rebbe is the mind of the yeshiva, the Rebbe is the vision of the yeshiva, the Rebbe is the judge and the determiner of the direction of the yeshiva, the policies, but the one who carries them through is the Frierdiker Rebbe. Where they get Bachim from? So the teretz was, in Lubavitch there was always Yoshvim, always. Yoshvim means Jungelite, who usually came from Lubavitcher homes, but not necessarily, who were already big lomdim. They learned in the regular yeshivas, as was the norm in Russia. They learned in the regular yeshivas, and they had achieved a certain shleimus in Torah. Emetz shleimus, nicht auf heintigen Sprache, auf einer malischen Sprache. And they wanted avodah, they wanted avodah Hashem, they wanted chassidus. So it came to Lubavitch. So these guys were in their 20s. Some of them were even married. And they got missions from their wives, and they would leave home for 6 months, for a year, for 2. The Rebbe said about his Zayden, bitte geheißen, the Meir Shleime. Right after Sheva Barachas, he left his wife and went to Lubavitch. And the Rebbe said, I don't know how he did it, but that's what happened. Right after Sheva Barachas, he left his wife and was gone for 6 months. That was, I can't. She must have been such a tzaddikus. But this is the Yeshua. So there was always a handful of Bocharim in the light who were learning in Lubavitch anyway. But they were on their own dime. You couldn't come to Lubavitch. Lubavitch was poor. It wasn't very expensive to live in Lubavitch. You had to rent a room by one of the locals, that's how they made up parnasa. They gave you twice a day. They fed you breakfast and supper, and they would sit in Lubavitch by the Rebbe Marash and by the Rebbe Rashab, and before by the Rebbe Tzemach, and they would learn a lot of Chassidus. And the Rebbe said Chassidus every Shabbos. So there was frische Chassidus, you understand? And this was their whole life, Chassidus. And the Rikir was how the Chassidus was maybe the day Maise. They didn't just learn Chassidus as a philosophy. They learned Chassidus as a derech and how to serve Hashem. And the Rabbeim were their personal tutors. That was the Seder, the Yoshvim. By the Rebbe Marash, the Seder was that till Tuesday morning, anybody could go in and ask him shvaylas on the Maimed of Shabbos. And these Yoshvim were very smart guys. They were not children, they were men. Intellectually, they were men. And they would take a Maimed and they would horavan a Maimed. If they didn't understand, they would go in and the Rebbe would help them. And of course, the Rebbe didn't teach them the philosophy of the Maimed. The Rebbe helped them with Avedas Hashem. So these Yoshvim were already there. So from those Yoshvim became the first 10 Tmimim. 10 Bochrim. I believe you could say that one of the first was Reb Zalman Havlin, Alav Hashalom. His name is listed amongst the Yoshvim Tafresh Vav. The Frierdiker Rebbe has a reshima of who were the young light who sat by the Rebbe Rashab before Tomchei Tmimim. You can see their names. Chanya Maroz was the first 10. I believe the Rav of Kfar Chabad, Rav Shneir, Gerel Shneir, the Rav, was also from the first 10. And they were sent to Zembin. They were sent to Zembin. Why were they sent to Zembin in Das Tachten? Because the Rebbe wanted a certain chassid to be the mashpia. This chassid's name was Shmuel Groinem Esterman. In the world of Lubavitch culture, it's called Groinem. Shmuel Groinem Esterman. Groinem would eventually move to Lubavitch. All the Bochrim from that golden generation, they talk about Groinem with unbelievable reverence. Unbelievable. He was the mashpia. And he sent them to Zembin to learn the winter of Tafresh Nun Ches. That means 1897 to 1898. People heard that there's a yeshiva, so they sent their sons. And there became a whole question of expanding the yeshiva. The Frierdiker Rebbe, I'm assuming with the direct involvement of his father, talked about it, and it was slow. In the beginning, they were very reluctant. And when they agreed to take Bochrim, in the beginning, they only took Elter Bochrim who really didn't need a yeshiva for instruction, how to learn. They needed a yeshiva for instruction, how to daven, like the Alter Rebbe said, Lenin, Kenech Abissel, Alter Rebbe's Chayel is coming. He said, I know how to learn a little, I want to learn how to daven. That's why they went to a Rebbe. That was the Seder Tomchei. Now, of course, just to complete the story, that Sunday they had this meeting, and the Rebbe announced as making a yeshiva, and they went looking. They took 10 Bochrim. The Seder started Wednesday. Chayel. Zusha, the partisan, Zusha, the Lamovsky, Zechrenia Levracha, used to say, you start a yeshiva Sunday, you start learning Wednesday. And for the Gemara, it took them 3 days to open up the Beis HaMedrash. But they opened up the kitchen immediately, so for 3 days, they went to Fabring. This is Zusha. Zusha was a Adam Godel. Zusha was a real soldier of the Rebbe's, Behemis. Anyway, so they started learning Chayelo. It was still the Sheva Brachas. But during the winter, after Tishrei, they were sent off to learn in Zembin. And the Frierdiker Rebbe says, when my father made the yeshiva, who was the mashpia behei hayediyah? Who was the first mashpia of Tomchei Tmimim? Who was the leader of from my father's perspective? The mashpia behei hayediyah was B'chaneich Hendel. Reb Hendel, as they called him, or Hendel Stam. His family was Kugel, B'chaneich Hendel Kugel. I think he came from the city of Kurenitz. Greinim was in Zembin, and Hendel was in Lubavitch. Reb Hendel was an old man. He was a very old man. Reb Hendel was a chassid from Tzemach Tzedek. And Reb Hendel was probably the third greatest influence in the Frierdiker Rebbe's life. The first influence of the Frierdiker Rebbe's life, you have to assume, was his father. The second influence of the Frierdiker Rebbe's life, you can assume, was his grandmother, the Rebbe Tzanifke. Handel raised him. The Rebbe Rashab was very sick when the Frierdiker Rebbe was a child. Handel was a giant. What the Frierdiker Rebbe says about Handel is, he had an ordinary mind, but he had the heart of a lion. And he says, normally, to have a great heart, you have to have a great mind. A great heart doesn't mean you're very emotional. Have such strong will, such deep feelings. Rabbi Handel in Kop is given Poshet. But in his heart, he was like mamish, like the Chassidim of the great Chassidim, the Tzemach Tzedek style. The Rebbe was a very big Chassid. So more than the greatest Chassid. And his Avos Yisrael was not normal. And his Avos Hashem, and his davening. I don't have time to tell you now stories. But the Frierdiker Rebbe tells a lot of stories about Rabbi Handel. He was the first mashpia. It didn't last long. If I'm not mistaken, he passed away within 6 months of the Hisyastus, but maybe he passed away 2 years. I'm not sure about the dates. But he was not Meirech Yomim. You know how he died? There was a fire in Lubavitch. A fire. And in a shtetl, a fire. The whole city, a whole row of houses burned. He was already an old man, and he stood in front of the row of burning houses. It wasn't his house. Screaming, Yiddische Geld brennt! And it killed him. That was his Avos Yisrael. Yiddische Geld brennt! It took his life. From Handel. I'll tell you one story about Handel and Tomchei Tmimim. One of the first 10 Tmimim was Chanya Marazov. Elchanan Dave Marazov. Who was an Adam Mesuyim. He was his Rosh Tevis in Aleph Dalad Mem. Elchanan Dave Marazov spells Adam. He was an Adam Mesuyim in Lubavitch. By the Rabbeim. He was so close. It was mamish like the Marazovs were mamish like family. They lived in the same house. In Rostov, they lived in the same house. Mendel Marazov thought I was a child. Where did I play? In the Frierdiker Rebbe's room. In his Cheder Yechidus. That was his playground. Mamish Mishpoche. Very, very close. They drafted him. He was already 22. Chani Marazov was born 2 years before the Frierdiker Rebbe. He was born Lamed Ches. The Rebbe Rayatz was born Mem. 1878, 1880. I think. Anyway, he was drafted. And in Russia, you couldn't play around. And I told you many times before, the Seder in Lubavitch was that if you got a draft notice, Simchas Torah Fartog, Simchas Torah in the morning, the Bocherim who were drafted would stand by the Rebbe Rashab. And the Rebbe Rashab would give them eitzis and brachas, and you knew from what the Rebbe Rashab said what the outcome would be. If the Rebbe said that the Rebbe was all helpful, you knew you're going to serve. You could tell from the different lashenis. Anyway, Chani was drafted. He went down to the draft board, and they let him out. It was a big simcha. Handel was much older than the Rebbe Rashab. Handel was some older than the Rebbe Marash. And he was so close. He was very, very close to the Rabbeim. He was so excited, he was running through the Chatzah singing, Chonye Zarois. Chonye was freed. And as he sang, he ran into the Rebbe Rashab's house, still singing. He ran into the Rebbe Rashab's room, where the Rebbe Rashab was working, which you don't do. And the Rebbe got up. And he put his hand on the Rebbe Rashab's shoulder, and the Rebbe Rashab put his hand on Handel's shoulder, and he went around twice. Chonye Zareis. And then the Rebbe Rashab sat back down. This was Handel. And the Frierdiker Rebbe said, Groinem was a maskel nifla. His knowledge and understanding of Chassidus was extraordinary. But he was not the first mashpia. The first mashpia of Tomchei Tmimim was Chanech Handel. Why? Because Tomchei Tmimim was created for Avodah. Avodah Tefillah. And Birer Amidis. Pnimius. The second mashpia of Tomchei Tmimim was Resh Batz. And Resh Batz was an Odom Godel. Reb Shmuel Betal Sheptel. And he was not just a great heart, he was a great mind. He was a Goan Amiti, he was a giant, Niglanista. Mendel Futafas said, I saw it in a video, that somebody once asked the Frierdiker Rebbe if there's a point in visiting the Tzion of a Chassid. Is there an inyan of visiting the grave of a Chassid? So the Frierdiker Rebbe said, a Chassid vi der Ashbatio. In other words, he was a Gehoy ben Erid. Ishbatz wasn't just a Chassid. He was a Ruchniz Dekerid. He was a higher person. He passed away in 1905, Samachei, 7 years after this Yastas. Handel was gone very shortly thereafter. But they were the face of, that was the Rebbe's vision, such personality. A third mashpia, Rashbatz, was very great. He was the personal tutor of two Rebbes. He was the private tutor of the Rebbe Rashab at the Gehadevit. And then when the Friedrich Rebbe became of age, if age means bar mitzvah, before bar mitzvah, the Rebbe Rashab hired him to be the personal tutor of the Friedrich Rebbe. The Friedrich Rebbe calls him Meiri Rashbatz. The Friedrich Rebbe calls him my teacher, the Rashbatz. The Friedrich Rebbe is called Meiri Rashbatz. He was also a big Talmud Chacham. The big Gaon in England and Chassidus was a big Ovid. And in Lubavitch was a Davar Mesuyim, Panamaise, which is in the Rishimis, also never known until now. The Rashbatz was Bam Tzemach Tzedek. I don't know if you know the story. He's the one that was beaten with a stick. And the Rebbe Tzemach Tzedek sent it to Michal Apotzke. And Michal Apotzke sent him with an empty pigeon. He told him not to open it. And he opened it. When he brought it to the Tzemach Tzedek took a look and said, "You read it, huh? You read it." It's my Rashbatz. He was the Rebbe Rashab's madrich. The Rebbe Maharash hired him to raise his son, the Rebbe. And then that Rebbe hired him again to raise his son, the Rebbe. So you can understand, you're not dealing with nothing push. So in the Rishimis of the Rebbe, there's a very poignant story. The Rashbatz prepared himself, and he went into the Rebbe Rashab to Yechidus. The Rashbatz was in Lubavitch before the Rebbe Rashab was born, you understand. He was much older than him. He was probably 30 years older than him. More, actually. And the Rebbe Rashab, the Rashbatz had sich meichen gewesen, like a chassid from Tzemach Tzedek knows how. He readied himself, and he went into the Rebbe Rashab. The Rebbe Rashab was in his early 30s. The Rashbatz was probably 70. The Rashbatz knew who he was. But he also had a shtickle understanding of who the Rebbe Rashab was. And he prepared himself to go into Yechidus. Not Yechidus halovos machste. A Yechidus like a chassid, a pnimisdik Yechidus. And he went into the Rebbe Nishma Seiden and he gave him a zettel. He put on a note, like a chassid goes into a Rebbe. And when the Rebbe saw him, the Rebbe Rashab, it was hard for the Rebbe Rashab. And the Rebbe Rashab, he motioned like I can't help you. I wish I could, but in other words, like what? He was so upset at Rashbatz, and the Rebbe would not be makabel to Yechidus. Now, you can't understand what's going on in their head. You only know the story that the Friedrich Rebbe told. The thoughts and the feelings behind. There's no way you can guess, but it's a guess. He ran out the Rashbatz, crying. And he said, Ki gershuni hayem yistapeach benachlas Hashem. David HaMelech had to run away from Eretz Yisrael because Shaul wanted to kill him. So he went to Chutlas, he went to Gas, he went to the Plishtim in the south of Eretz Yisrael, Gaza. And he cried. He said, I was kicked out of Eretz Yisrael. Ki gershuni. So the Rashbatz ran out of the Rebbe Nishma Seiden's room, crying. And he says, Met mir arois geworfen. He didn't take it the way the Rebbe Rashab meant it. The Rebbe Rashab said, how can I give you? You're my Rebbe. How can I become your Rebbe? I'm assuming. But the Rashbatz felt that there was a chasaron in him. The Rebbe wasn't taking him to Yechidus because the Rebbe couldn't take him. He didn't see it as a problem in the Rebbe. He saw it as a problem himself. He says, I was just thrown out of Lubavitch. That's in say it in grubbe Werte, in very unrefined words. He was the second mashpia in Lubavitch, in Tomchei Tmimim. A third personality that I'm going to mention is there was a chassid by the name of Reb Michal Bliner. He was called Reb Michal der Alter. He was a very old man. And he came from Nevel. Nevel was a very, very Chassidish city. So his name was Reb Michal Bliner, Reb Michal der Alter, Reb Michal Nevel. He passed away in Tafresh Ayin in 1910, 5 years after the Rashbat. He was a Malamed his whole life. He taught children alphabets. But he was a giant of a chassid, a oivid and a chassid and a pnimi. And the Rebbe asked him to move to Lubavitch. The Rebbe Rashab asked him to move to Lubavitch to be a mashpia. So he came to Lubavitch. He was an old man. He was in his 70s or 80s. Years ago, somebody, when I would mention his name, would say that there's a blinid, there's an einikl of his living on the corner, maybe Mrs. Itkin. One of the people used to come to these classes, whenever I mentioned his name, yeah, you had a karav da, an einikl. Blinid, I'm sorry, I don't know, but he was a very big chassid. No, the story with him is that he was in the middle of Krishma, and he saw a bacher. It was in the middle of Krishma with torn shoes, and he called over the bacher. He took off his shoes, his boots, and he gave the bacher the boots, and he took the bacher's torn boots. He went and he washed his hands. And if you knew who he was, there was like it's like a neshama coming from Atzilus and going into a bar. It was so nishlef yerke. So someone said, "Mechol, mitten davnen, you could." Mitten Krishma is Yechudi Allah. He says, "Was is Krishma? Yechudi Allah. Atamim Shich. Das is Yechudi Allah." This was the Michal bin. The shoes of Atamim. This is Yechudi Allah. It's a very big chassid. I heard from the Melech, I think, that when he would teach Anila Deidi, the famous Anila Deidi, he would get to. I don't know. Maybe I heard from Rabbi Shlomo Zarkis or Gezunzayin. One of the two. I think it's so many years ago. My memory is not what it was. He couldn't teach past a certain point. He would start learning the Maimed. When it got to a point which is talking about tshuva, he'd become Pashat so emotional, he couldn't continue. He's a kumtzedik Martin. So they came back the next day and say he couldn't get past it. He was a very great oivid, a big chassid, a great oivid. And then of course there was Groinim. Groinim was young. Groinim was a chassid from the Rebbe Marash. Groinim passed away in 1921, Tafresh Peyalef. He was around 70 when he died. He was by the Tzemach Tzedek as a teenager. He was by the Tzemach Tzedek before the Estalkus. I don't know if you know the famous story about the Eitz Chaim. I've told you the story many times. How once the Tzemach Tzedek said a Maimer and he contradicted Eitz Chaim, and it bothered Reb Shmuel Ber Bariseve, the Rashdam, and it didn't seem to bother anybody else. So he went around to the brothers asking them, remember that story? Asking them Pshat and the Eitz Chaim. And the last one he went into was the Rebbe Marash. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. He went by the chutzner. He saw the Rebbe Marash's window was on, light was on. So before he knocked on the door, he looked through the shutters. And the Rebbe Marash was sitting like this with the Eitz Chaim. So he knocks on the door. And the Rebbe Marash says, "Wer da?" He says, "Shmuel Ber." Who's there? A minute. The door opens. The Eitz Chaim is gone. And there's a table full of newspapers. International. Berlin. Paris. London, Antwerp, opened up to the stock pages. So Shmuel Ber says, "I have a problem with Eitz Chaim." So he jumped to me for Eitz Chaim, stocks and bonds. Eitz Chaim, you go to my brother. So Shmuel Ber says, "Listen to me. You're going to help me with Eitz Chaim, but tomorrow the whole Lubavitch knows what I saw through your window." I'm not a fool. And they spent the whole night talking, and he said, so how do we know this story? The Marash. So the Arizal, Eitz Chaim from Arizal, had read a story. Groinim was a young man with a Tzemach Tzedek was nostalgic. Groinim, who would be the Mashpi in Lubavitch. And there was war. It was war. Lubavitch was divided into 4 camps. Amongst the brothers, they were brothers, and they were G'deilim. But on the streets it was Poshet Sakonis. And there were Kpedis from the Rabbeim. Mentioned Poshet Gishtorben. I don't think he was 20. He was old enough to have a depth and to appreciate that Lubavitch was important and Chassidus was important. It wasn't just on a political alliance, but he was so afraid. So he went to his mashpia. Who was his mashpia? Shmuel Ber Bariseve. He was the mashpia in Jembin. He says, "What should I do? These are the Tzemach Tzedek's children. How do I choose?" So Rabbi Shmuel Ber says to him, "Ich will dem nicht sagen. I'm not going to tell you where to go. Aber ich will dir erzählen am meisten." And he told him the story. The story comes to us through Groinim. That Groinim was a young man. He probably was less than 20. He was around 20. And he was a Lubavitcher Chassid, a good cop. He was a Malamed. He was very, very poor. Groinim was very poor. When he came to Lubavitch, he had a normal job. Until then, he was a Malamed. He used to learn Chassidus by moonlight. He couldn't afford candles, by moonlight. And it mattered to him. I'm sure he was very disturbed by the machlokes, but the ikir is he was looking for emes. So his mashpiyas, I'm not going to tell you what to choose, I'm just going to tell you this story. So he stayed in Lubavitch. Greiner was from the younger light from the Rebbe Marash, and then later by the Rebbe Rashab, and the Rebbe Rashab was meyakid him. But the Rebbe Rashab, the Rebbe Rashab recruited him. The Rebbe Rashab said we need Greiner. And all of the great chassidim that we knew, I mean, the Shmuel Levitin LaMarshal, he spoke about the Rashbats. He remembered the Rashbats. He probably remembered even Hendel. But most of the people that lived here in America, their mashpia was even Chacha Fagin. Who was Chacha Fagin's mashpia? Greiner. In terms of Haskalah, in terms of understanding Hasidus, he was the constant, and he lived the whole 20 years or 22 years of Tomchei Tmimim until the Rebbe Rashab's Histalkus. He was the main mashpia, and he taught a lot of Hasidus. He fabrenged a lot, and he also was a Mednik about Shmua. He knew most of the stories that we have from the early generations of Lubavitch that are not from the Frierdiker Rebbe come to us through various different Hasidim. All of them got from Greiner. Zalman, Duchman got from Greiner, and Folle Khan got from Greiner, and Yudel Chitri got from Greiner, and Itche de Masmed got from Greiner. He's really the pipe, the chain. He had two mashpiyim. The first was Shmuel Bar Yisrael, was a big maskell, and the other was Avram Kejemina. Avram Kejemina was the Rav. His last name was Landau. Yankel Landau was an amical of his. Avram Kejemina was the Jemina Rav. He was a big chassid. And his greatness, Greiner once asked him, Avram Kejemina, what is your greatness? And he says, Shimusha Shalteira. He knew a lot of Sipurim. So Greiner had two mashpiyim who gave him a lot of stories from the times of the Tzemach Tzedek and back, and Greiner gave it to his Talmidim, and they recorded it, and that's how these stories reach us. So he's very, very important, really, in the history of Lubavitch. He was the mashpiyah. Anyway, the yeshiva started off in Jembin with 10 Bachrim that winter, and it became Pesach. They were talking about bringing in more Bachrim. So in the beginning, it was very slow. And in the beginning was only El to the Bachrim. But as time passed, the yeshiva began to grow. First of all, Greiner and Poshet physically moved his family to Lubavitch. So the Bachrim was sent to Yemen and moved back to Lubavitch. And they built him a base medrash. You know, one of the sweet stories is the Rebbe Rashab's mother was still alive, the Rebbe Tzendrivke. And when he was still thinking about making the yeshiva, he went into his mother and said, Mama, I have a thought. I want to hear your take on it. He said to his mother, I'm thinking to make a yeshiva. She said, great idea, great idea. So he says to his mother, Mama, was willen ze yes? There was no money. What are they going to eat? So she said, was haste? Was middle lessons willen ze yes? Her answer was, what do you mean? Whatever we eat, they'll eat. That's it. The Rebbe Rashab used to call the Bachrim the kinder, children. And in the earlier years, I'm assuming when the yeshiva was smaller and the Bachrim were greater, the Rebbe Rashab took a personal interest in every individual Bachrim. Every individual Bachrim. And there's letters and there's known Yechidesen where the Rebbe gave instructions to the Frierdiker Rebbe how to raise the Bachrim and so on. There was a very intimate yachas. As the yeshiva grew and grew and grew, this relationship became a little bit more remote. But the Rebbe Rashab saw the Bachrim Tomchei Tmimim like the apple of his eye. I told you this before. The Rebbe Rashab, somebody once told the Rebbe Rashab that Tomchei Tmimim turned back the clock 50 years. So the Rebbe Rashab said with a smile, 100 Jahr und nefshe noch mehr. 100 years, which means the time of the Alter Rebbe, and maybe more. I heard from my mashpiyim that the Frierdiker was in Eretz Yisrael. The Frierdiker was in Eretz Yisrael in 1929. And there was a Mesibe. There was a gathering of Elter Chassidim. There's a letter from the Frierdiker Rebbe to his youngest daughter, Shendel, where he describes how he felt during those few hours. He was in Gan Eden, he says. All of his tzaras were gone, because he was looking at these old Chassidim and he was seeing his great-grandfather and his grandfather and his uncles and his... So during this Fabreng, during one of these Fabreng missions, one of the Chassidim started talking about the Rebbe Rashab and the Rebbe Rashab's moifsim, the Rebbe Rashab's miracles. So the Frierdiker Rebbe interrupted him. Der größte Meufes von Taten ist gewesen der Tmimim. The greatest miracle of my father were the Bochrim of Yeshiva's Tomchei Tmimim. It was a level of not just Torah, but the Ikar of Avodah that was way after its time. This kind of Avodas Hashem was true by Chveis, by the Tzemach Tzedek, by the Mittler Rebbe. I read someplace that there was a chassid named Reb Sheil Ber, Reb Sheil Zislin. He lived later in Tel Aviv. And the Rebbe Rashab told him, I get letters from your Bochrim like Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe. Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe. This was what Tomchei Tmimim became. But the yeshiva grew, and they started taking younger Bochrim. So there were all kinds of rules. One of the distinctions of Tomchei Tmimim was that they provided with room and board. In the yeshivas in Russia, all the big yeshivas in Russia, it was impossible to get in. But it wasn't about tuition. Today it's only about tuition. They only took the best minds. But the yeshiva didn't charge. How the Rosh Yeshivas lived, I don't know. The Bochrim learned in yeshiva that didn't cost a penny. But there were no provisions. There was no dormitory. And there was no kitchen. And there was no kupas bachurim. The Bochrim had to bring money on their own to support themselves for room and board and clothing. And if you needed, God forbid, medicine. The yeshivas didn't provide. The yeshivas, Lubavitch was considered modern. It was so fashlept. It was so neberdik. But they officially gave the Bochrim a room and board. When the yeshiva expanded, they started taking what they called the Chadorim, they called it. Like the equivalent of high school. Mesifta Bochrim, this the Rabbeim they did not take upon themselves. The boys who joined the Chadorim, they had to make their own arrangements in terms of Achsani, where they would stay and what they would eat. The Elter Bochrim, the equivalent of post-high school, the yeshiva provided them room and board. And there's all kinds of different tkufas. Lubavitch during its heyday had hundreds of Talmidim, hundreds. 300-400 boys sitting in one room at the same time learning Torah. Mamish. It was a very, very big and successful yeshiva. Problem is I'm out of time and I have so much more to say. So I guess I'll say the Nekuda and then I'll stop. If I want to make a hemshech, maybe I don't know what tomorrow's schedule is. Morgen is Labor Day on a parad. So I don't know if she's planning to have a class or not, but maybe I'll talk tomorrow more. I'll continue this conversation. I'll just say one Nekuda. Two Nekudas. Number one, Simchas Torah Tafresh Nun Tes. The yeshiva was a little more than a year old. The Rebbe Rashab was going to the last Hakofer. The last Hakofer is Kodesh V'nei Reishiana Racham Achan Natzlicha Hashem V'Yisrael B'Yenu. They say Tomchei Tmimim Yeshiva Takif La'ad Hatzlicha Tomim V'Maisav Anenu V'Yem Kareinu. And the Rebbe is holding a Sefer Torah, and he says Kodesh V'nei Reishiana Racham Achan Natzlicha Shem Rebis Anenu V'Yem Kareinu Tomchei Tmimim Yeshiva. And he stops and he says, we made a yeshiva, and we have Bochrim all learning in this yeshiva, but the yeshiva does not have a name. He's holding a Sefer Torah. He says, so I'm announcing that the name of the yeshiva is Tomchei Tmimim, and the Bochrim who learn in her, u'misnahagim berucha, who behave according to the spirit of Tomchei Tmimim, are called Tmimim. This is the first vart. 2 years later, also Simchas Torah, Tafresh Samach Aleph, I'm almost sure. So it was 3 years after the yeshiva was made. The Frierdiker Rebbe describes how the Rebbe asked all the Bochrim who had been in the yeshiva first to come and stand in front of him. And the Rebbe Rashab spoke very sharp that the halacha is that when you have a field, a tree, you plant, the first 3 yards is orla. So the Rebbe said to them, you're orla. He says, the Frierdiker Rebbe says they were standing there, and the Rebbe is telling them that they're no good. They were so good, but they were the experiment. Tomchei Tmimim learned itself on them. And he describes the Heisa Tren. The Rebbe's Gimel Shnei Sallah. Anyway, but the Hemshech or whatever, not Hemshech, the Rebbe said the famous Sicha Kol HaYetzel Melchames Beis David Get Krisis Case of Leishtei. He said why he made the yeshiva. And of course he spoke about the matzav of Yiddishkeit in Russia at that time. And he said, there's no need for yeshivas. There's so much Torah. He says, but we need a Torah Tmima Teda Nigla Chsidis, Teda what Yiras Shamayim. And the Rebbe Rashab said in that Sikha, that the Gemara says, Imra Isa Deir Achal Deir Mecharef U'Megadef Tzapei L'Raglav Shal Mashiach. If you see one generation and then another generation, one after the other without a break, that are apokursim, that are blaspheming, Tzapei L'Raglav, anticipate Mashiach's coming. Like it says in the end of Kapitel Pei Tes, Asher Cherfu Oivecha Hashem, Asher Cherfu Ikvis Mishichacha, and then it says, Baruch Hashem La'elam Amen V'Yamin. So the Gemara says, Asher Cherfu Ikvis Mishichacha is one, Cherfu Oivecha Hashem is one generation. Asher Cherfu Ikvis Mishichacha is the second generation. And then Baruch Havaya La'elam Amen V'Yamin, this is Mashiach. So the Rebbe said in 1900 that Istavel Kumen Zwei Yevles. There are going to be two jubilees. A jubilee is 50 years. The first Yevel is going to be Asher Cherfu Oivecha Havaya. The Chevre Mafitze Askola, the Rebbe Rashab starts to talk about the Apakursim. Jewish intellectuals with their heresy. He said then there's going to come another Yevel, when it's going to be Feine Erlachayid, good, righteous Jews. But you say the word Mashiach. So the Rebbe said, I remember I was at the Fabrengen. The Rebbe said 85 years, I think it's Memhei. He said that this Sikha that the Rebbe Rashab said in 1900 was a Nevuah Berura. Mamish, to say in 1900 what was going to happen over the next 100 years, and it was exactly what happened. Exactly, Genoy. Exactly how it played out. There was a whole period where Yidden never lost their Emunah and lost their Yiddishkeit because of all these smart guys. It started in the brain. Not like today. It starts in the Taivus and in the depression and in the abuse. It started in the brain. And then there's another thing. Mashiach became a bad word. I don't know why. You mention Mashiach, then mention Meshuggah, as if it's some kind of Krida Rachmana Litzlan. And the Rebbe said 123 years ago, or 121 years ago, 119 years ago, that this is the mandate of Tomchei Tmimim. And that the Bachram will learn at Tomchei Tmimim, their inas, the Rebbe said all the time, are Nedes Lahoyer, to machen lichtig, to make light in the world, and to be Yetzel Mechamas Beis David, to fight the battle for the coming of Mashiach Tzidkenu. And the price is, get Krisis case of Ishtei. Ishtei, that means your wife, he touched Gashmias. You have to be prepared to divorce Gashmias in order to be involved in this Milchama of bringing Mashiach Tzidkenu. Okay, maybe I'll continue.